Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to start by pointing out that we are gathered on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. Madam Speaker, I'm honoured to rise today to speak to Bill C-10, an act to amend the Broadcasting Act and to make consequential amendments to other acts.
Start by illustrating the situation we live in this House. Digital technologies have completely changed the way Canadians discover stories, how they stay informed, how they are entertained, and how they learn and share with each other. From 2011 to 2019, the number of Canadians with Netflix subscriptions has grown from 1 in 10 to nearly 6 in 10. And the number of Canadians using Spotify to listen to music online has jumped from 2% in 2014 to nearly 30% in 2019. We welcome these innovations that bring so much richness to our lives, so much diverse content. However, prolonging the status quo will only further undermine our ability to tell our own Canadian stories. Si on ne réagit pas, c'est le...
If we don't react, funding for Canadian television production will continue to decline. What we risk in the long run is nothing less than a loss of our cultural sovereignty. The production of French, English, and Aboriginal works will be at risk, so we are taking action. The Broadcasting Act dates back to 1991, before the Internet, smartphones, and online platforms. It's a regulatory framework that's frozen in the past. On the one hand, we have homegrown companies playing by the rules and investing in our Canadian stories. On the other, online broadcasters operating outside of any regulatory framework, taking advantage of the system without any obligation to contribute. And no, Madam Speaker, resistance is not futile.
Traditional broadcasters and a lack of for online broadcasters doesn't work. This outdated regulatory framework is unfair for our Canadian businesses. It threatens Canadian jobs. It undermines Canada's ability to tell here our own stories. Trois objectifs principaux nous motivent à déposer.
There are three main objectives that motivate us to introduce this bill. First of all, the legislation will contribute to our cultural sovereignty. Canada is rich with 2 official languages and the unique history and experience of Indigenous peoples.
To make sure Canadians can tell their own stories, express their own culture, now and in the future. Deuxièmement,
Secondly, the implementation of the new Canadian audiovisual regime that this legislation will enable will generate close to $1 billion in foreign investment per year in our films, television, and music. That means more jobs for our economy, more opportunities for our creators, and talented production workers for our artists, designers, authors, and many other cultural specialties for which we are internationally recognized. This also means greater stability for their sector. These are the same people who helped entertain us and made us smile during the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, and now the second wave we are going through together. Thirdly, the legislation is about fairness. Asking online broadcasters to do their fair share isn't a luxury, it's about fairness.
The government believes that those who benefit from the Canadian system should contribute to it fairly. This legislation will provide stronger financing mechanisms and give more preeminence to what is produced in Canada in English, en français, and Indigenous languages. It will encourage better representation at all levels of production for equity-seeking groups, for women, for members of the LGBTQ communities, for people with disabilities, and for racialized Canadians, including Blacks and people of color. En fait, ce projet...
In fact, this bill truly gives Canadian creators and producers the means to achieve their ambitions. It recognizes the diversity of Canadian perspectives and their contribution to our rich and unique culture. A modernized act would ensure that Canadians from all backgrounds and identities are reflected in, participate in, and benefit from the broadcasting system. In short, our stories and music must have a place in the world of online broadcasting.
In a more practical manner, this bill proposes the implementation of a modern, flexible regulatory framework for the CRTC to apply fair rules to all broadcasters and make sure that it has the necessary tools to do its job effectively. We will also go a step further, and we will instruct the CRTC how to use these new tools. This will happen once the bill receives royal assent, and this bill makes amendments that allow for this essential policy directive. Dans nos instructions au CRTC,
in our instructions to the CRTC, we wish to recognize the specific needs of French and the Canadian francophonie in a digital world dominated by English. On this point, I'd like to add that this is perfectly in line with the throne speech, which mentions that the government has a responsibility to protect and promote French, not only outside Quebec, but also in Quebec. And I know that this is an important point for all members of this House, but also for all of Canada, because the protection and promotion of French is paramount for everyone.
De retour aux instructions du CRTC,
returning to the CRTC's instructions, we want to also give special consideration to Aboriginal communities and to better recognize their realities and contributions. Finally, we wish to focus on racialized communities to ensure that they are fairly represented in the ecosystem.
Works is that it establishes a minimum of investment from Canadian broadcasters into our ecosystem. In effect, this creates a baseline of investment. With this bill and this intended policy direction to the CRTC, we aim for the CRTC to add an additional mechanism on top of the baseline. We intend to ask the CRTC to implement an incentive mechanism that would encourage behaviors that are inclusive and ensure no one is left behind. Some of the elements we would like to see being incentivized are diversity in key creative positions, the role and place of Black Canadians in our system, the retention of our rich intellectual property in Canada, and fair and transparent compensation for our musicians. Madame la Présidente,
Madam Speaker, I'd like to emphasize that we are listening to Canadians. The bill responds to key recommendations made by the Independent Blue Ribbon Panel last January. Urgent action was needed to bring online broadcasters into the system.
Our approach is balanced, and we've made the choice to exclude a number of areas from the new regime. User-generated content will not be regulated. News content will not be regulated. Video games will be excluded. Furthermore, only broadcasters that have a significant impact in Canada will be subject to the legislation. In practice, this means that only known names and brands will be subject to this legislation. Lorsque ma fille ouvre une plateforme de streaming,
when my daughter opens a streaming platform, I, like many parents, would like her to be offered with the choice of watching a series from here with her favorite actors like Vincent Guillaume Otis from District 31. I'd also like to see a documentary on Canadian Aboriginal history, for example. After all, it's our story and it's ours to tell. When my daughter listens to music on another platform, I would like her to be offered a playlist of local artists, or even, why not, from my hometown in Mauricie. What we propose will not only allow her to benefit from the choice among international offer, but will also enable her to discover content from here, content that can be financed by a contribution from these same digital platforms. We know how important it is to be represented in all our complexity on screen and in production. With the modernization of this law, our francophone, anglophone, Aboriginal, disabled, visible minority, and LGBTQ creators will have the means to tell their own stories and, more importantly, to see and hear them. It will be beneficial for both broadcasters and the public to showcase stories that resonate with us, that challenge us, and that bring us together as Canadians and Quebecers.
Beneficial for streamers and for Canadians to showcase stories that resonate with us, that reflect our history, and that brings us together. Ce projet de loi fait partie.
This bill is part of a broader approach in which our government is deeply and wholeheartedly committed to ensuring fairness for all. The giants of the web are earning billions of dollars in our economy and from our content. Some are among the most powerful companies in the world, and they operate outside of any regulatory framework.
More free rides. It's about fairness. It's about everyone doing their fair share. We are, in fact, starting to see this across the world. The European Union has adopted new rules on streamers, resulting in increased investments, jobs, choice of content, and ability to assert one's own cultural sovereignty. The United States has launched legal proceedings against Google for abusing its dominant market position. Australia is tackling the threat that journalism is facing through a mandatory code of conduct targeted at Facebook and Google. And several other countries, including Canada, are concerned about misinformation, online hate, and web's giant blatant inability to self-regulate. Voluntary self-regulation does not work. And let me remind you, most of all, of these initiatives that have garnered support across the political spectrum across the world. They should not be a right-left divide on these issues. Divisions only benefit large multi-billion-dollar companies, not our constituents. That's why I'm urging all members of this House to work together constructively and ensure that this important bill passes through second reading hastily so that the committee can start doing their important work to amend, improve, and move forward. Let's show the world that Canada is united and standing up for itself. Aujourd'hui, en proposant de...
Today, by proposing to modernize the Broadcasting Act, we are standing up for culture. We are continuing to move forward on these essential reforms. We are standing up for Canadian businesses and creators, saying that everyone who benefits from the system must contribute. We are standing up for Canadians and Quebecers. We stand up for Aboriginal peoples who have been underrepresented for too long. We stand up for artists, musicians, directors, and producers who want to practice their art in French from one end of the country to the other. These are the same Canadians, Quebecers, and Aboriginal people who expect and want to recognize themselves in the programs they choose to listen to and watch. They expect their stories to be told in their own language, to reflect Canada's diversity and the rich culture of Aboriginal peoples. The Broadcasting Act, passed in 1991, has served our society well, but it predates the digital age and is not adapted to it, something that we can no longer afford to ignore. Our regulator, the CRTC, also has few tools in its toolbox to ensure that the broadcasting ecosystem continues to serve Canadians. It has to deal with a media landscape that has changed significantly in 30 years. By introducing the bill, our government is responding to a pressing need to adapt Canada's legislative framework to today's digital reality. In the letter of mandate given to me by the Prime Minister, modernizing the Broadcasting Act is one of my prime responsibilities. The Prime Minister asked me to examine, and I quote, how to best support Canadian stories in English and French. He asked me to introduce legislation by the end of 2020 that takes appropriate steps to ensure that providers, including web giants, offer more Canadian stories in their repertoires, contribute to the creation in both official languages, and promote and make Canadian stories more easily accessible on their platforms, and this without neglecting our country's diverse cultural and linguistic communities. That bill that our government introduced in this House on November 3rd, 2009 responds exactly to that. It's important to update this legislation to ensure the continuity and vitality of our Canadian series, films, and music, and those who produce and broadcast them. I hope that the members of this House have now understood that On the one hand, we have Canadian companies playing by the rules and investing in Canadian culture. On the other, we have online broadcasters who take advantage of our system without any obligation to contribute, and that one regime for our broadcasters and another regime for online broadcasters doesn't work.
Amendments to the Act to support Canadian creators and independent Canadian producers, to ensure the viability of Canadian broadcasting, and to protect Canada's cultural sovereignty. Madam Speaker, the purpose of the bill is to level the playing field and ensure funding for Canadian stories and Canadian talent. It would allow us to give a higher profile to what is produced in Canada in English, en français, and in Indigenous languages, and encourage better representation of racialized Canadians, women, and equity-seeking groups at all levels of production. This bill truly empowers Canadian creators and producers. It reflects the diversity of Canadian perspective. A modernized act would affirm and strengthen our Francophone, Anglophone, Indigenous, and Black identities, as well as all of our country's diversity, by helping us to tell stories that speak to our experiences and values. Bear in mind, we are imposing a number of guardrails. As I said earlier, user-generated content, news content, and video games will not be subject to the new regulations. Furthermore, entities will need to reach a significant economic threshold before any regulation can be imposed. This keeps the nature of the internet as it is, simply asking companies that generate large revenues in Canada to contribute in a fair manner. What we are proposing will not impact consumer choices. It will not limit what any of those streamers can showcase in Canada, and it won't impose a price increase. Foreign platforms will benefit from proposing local content that resonates for its subscribers.
Stories presented from their perspective in their own language, or stories that introduce them to the experiences of others who they share a country with. This initiative brings people together and will promote social harmony.
Polarized times, having varied content that reflects our different experiences and perspectives across the country throughout our shared stories help us to understand one another, to listen. May it be an Indigenous perspective, Black, people with disabilities, women, we all have something to learn from each other. Through their creative work, artists truly have a way to make us reflect, understand, and feel what others feel. Global platforms will invest in local content, and by the same token, will allow our local content greater reach globally. This legislation will also generate investment in Canada and create jobs, two important drivers for reopening creative industries and ensuring their sustainability. This is no small feat when we consider that the broadcasting, audiovisual, music, and interactive media sectors contribute $20.4 billion to Canada's GDP and represent more than 160,000 jobs. Madam Speaker, I'd like to conclude by saying that Bill C-10, an act to amend the Broadcasting Act and to make consequential amendments to other acts, is the result of a collective effort. It is the result of a considerable amount of work by my colleagues, the public service, a vast array of stakeholders, and the Broadcasting and Telecommunication Legislative Review Panel. I would like to thank the Minister of Economic Development and Official Languages and the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry for establishing the review panel and putting forward the notion that every participant in the Canadian broadcasting system had to contribute to the creation, production, and promotion of Canadian stories. I would also like to thank the Leader of the Government in the House of Commons for making this bill a legislative priority for our government. Lastly, I would like to thank all of those who've contributed to this important file.
With this bill, we're taking a step in the right direction. Our government has chosen a phased-in approach, a targeted approach to modernize the Canadian broadcasting system without delay and in an appropriate manner. We recognize that the work is not done. Other measures will follow, including the important role of CBC Radio-Canada and the various funding mechanisms for the audiovisual production sector.
This bill is about investing in Canada, this bill is about equity, and this bill is about what it means at the very core to be Canadian. If you don't agree with all of the bill, If you don't believe in our cultural sovereignty, that we as Canadians, as Francophones, as First Nation, as Métis, as Inuit, we are different, then you can still support the bill for the jobs it will create. But let me reiterate, Madam Speaker, that resistance is not futile. If jobs and investment in the cultural sector isn't what you believe in future for our country, then support this bill for the much-needed equity and fairness we need to reestablish the fact that everyone, including white giants, must contribute to our society. Thank you, Madam.
And it is now time for questions and comments. Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député.
The honourable member for Lévis, Les Etchemins, Bellechasse. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for his speech. Indeed, there is a broad consensus that something has to be done. The status quo is not acceptable anymore. Unfortunately, when you think about the web giants, you get the impression that this bill gives them a free pass because it doesn't really say how Facebook is going to be dealt with and their advertising revenues and so on. Why has the minister given the web giants, particularly Facebook, this free pass? The Honourable Minister. I'd like to thank the member for Lévis, Bellechasse, Les Etchemins for his question, Madam Speaker. I said this a number of times. This bill is a first step in this adventure, which is to create a regulatory framework that will apply to the web giants. I'm the first to admit there's more to be done. This is the first step in addressing the issue of the web giants when it comes to audiovisual production. And I mentioned another bill which will specifically apply to the web giants that my colleague just referred to. We are working with governments in Australia and France. They too are currently developing the same type of regulation. Thank you. Questions and comments? Honourable Member for Drummond. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to congratulate the Minister of Heritage for his very first piece of legislation that he's tabled, a highly anticipated bill to overhaul the broadcasting system. It's no mean feat. I was expecting something a bit more consistent, and there's one thing I'd like to ask the Minister about, which is a provision in the bill under which any broadcasting company in Canada has to be effectively controlled by Canadians or owned by Canadians. And this bill, C-10, does away with that provision. What does the minister intend to do to protect our market from foreign takeovers in broadcasting by massive foreign companies? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. You can't, on the one hand, say that the regulations and the law should apply to the web giants, and at the same time, on the other hand, say that that the law won't apply to them. So what this bill will do is ensure that it applies to the web giants, but that's not the provision that ensures that companies remain effectively controlled or owned by Canadians. We're not changing anything about the ownership rules when it comes to Canadian broadcasters. In fact, Canadian broadcasters will still have to get licenses from the CRTC. And beyond this bill, there are other protections against foreign takeovers, which my colleague at Innovation and Science or myself have to rule on. There are other protections, but the provision in question would make it possible to apply our laws to those web giants. Otherwise, we can't apply our laws to them. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for his speech. I have a technical question. After the Riles report, the idea was that all players have to participate in the production of Canadian or Quebec content. So if I get some cultural content through a cable that attaches to my TV, well, then those people have to take part in Canadian or Quebec cultural production. But if I get something over the internet through Wi-Fi, those people don't have to participate in Canadian or Quebec production. Can the minister explain the logic behind that, the distinction between a cable or a Wi-Fi connection? The Honourable Minister. Well, what the Riles report said about access providers was that because these are companies, infrastructure companies, they should have to invest in infrastructure. And we would ask those that produce content to invest in content. That's the basic logic, according to the Riles report. So what we're doing, and I want to point this out, I want to stress this here in the House, this is the first time in Canadian history that Canadian broadcasting legislation will apply to the web giants. That's never happened before. And they will have to invest almost $1 billion a year. The web giants, it's actually more than $1 billion, because if nothing is done by 2023, it will be at least $1 billion more for our production, for our artists, for our creators here in Canada. So this will add almost $1 billion to the monies available for our artists and musicians. Questions and comments?
I'm a Ladysmith.
Sorry, Madam Speaker, I couldn't hear you. Sometimes when the translation switches from French to English, I don't hear the English at all. I'd like to thank the Honourable Minister for his speech and for bringing forward this legislation. As somebody who's worked in the broadcast industry for years and worked with First Nations producers, television producers, and others who have been marginalized by the mainstream media historically, I think this is really important that this bill comes forward. I'm wondering about the CBC. We've heard from Friends of Canadian Broadcasting that they're disappointed that the CBC wasn't included in this bill, and I'm wondering if there's plans for amendments to how the government works with the CBC, budget changes, anything that's coming up that will improve the situation for our national broadcaster.
Honourable Minister.
I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for his question, Madam Speaker. The CBC, Radio-Canada, is a very important institution to Canadians from coast to coast to coast. The member may recall that it was our government that made a record-level investment in the CBC in the previous mandate. After 10 years of cutbacks by the Harper government, we have every intention to implement other reforms in the coming months. We couldn't do it as part of this particular bill, but we strongly believe on this side of the House, Madam Speaker, in the importance and the role that CBC plays in Canada, and we will continue to be there for them. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And if I may, just to thank the Minister for not only is it outstanding legislation, but I know his high sense of commitment to Canada's arts and culture community, and it's reflected inside this bill. I know personally he actually met with one of my favorite groups, the Folklorama group in Winnipeg, which spends so much energy into arts and festivals and so forth. And if he could just provide his thoughts in regards, again, to how this bill will not only protect our culture going forward, but it will actually provide those needed jobs in an industry that is so critical to our nation.
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for his question. As I said earlier, this is a very important sector. It's contributing $20 billion to Canada's GDP, 160,000 jobs across the country. And what we're doing by introducing this bill is protecting Canadian cultural sovereignty, is protecting these jobs. Of course, some American companies are coming to Canada to film series or movies, service productions, and this is great. But unless we intervene, what we are losing is our ability to tell our own stories, I watch series from all around the world, and I really love them, but first and foremost, I like to watch Canadian series and Canadian movies and listen to Canadian music. And unless something is done, Canada will become nothing less than a production service outlet for the United States of America. This government doesn't want that. This bill prevents that from happening and gives us back our cultural sovereignty.
Avant de poursuivre,
Before continuing debate pursuant to Standing Order 38, it's my duty to inform the House that the questions to be raised tonight at the time of adjournment are as follows.
Foreign Affairs, the Honourable Member for Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies, Fisheries and Oceans, and the Honourable Member for Langley Aldergrove on Infrastructure. Reprise du débat, l'honorable.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Richmond, Arthabaska. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank, first of all, the Minister for tabling this legislation today, and I'm very happy to be able to talk about it here in the House and give our party's position on the debate that we'll be having today, tomorrow, and in the days to come. This bill, C-10, an act to amend the Broadcasting Act and to make related and consequential amendments to other acts, is a significant piece of legislation. It's been long awaited. For a long time, the entire community has been waiting for changes with the arrival of the internet and digital productions. This legislation has not been changed in 28 years. There was the Riles report, and the idea is to have web giants covered by the Canadian Broadcasting Act. I think there's a consensus among parties and stakeholders that the Broadcasting Act needs to be modernized. And there's also a consensus among many stakeholders, and I'm convinced among the other opposition parties, that the legislation should have included web giants and social media and a number of other things. We say that this was highly awaited. I think we were expecting a bit more. This legislation should include things like print media. They are having a hard time surviving because of declining revenues. The minister explained that the Liberal strategy is to divide these issues up into many parts, but we think that's regrettable because there was an urgency to this and people were expecting this to be included in this legislation, but it isn't. There are also some technical issues that we were hoping could be resolved with this bill, differences between conventional companies and online companies. And I could name some of the things that are missing from this bill that we think should have been there. There's nothing for social media like Facebook and Google, nothing requiring them to pay their fair share. There's the issue of the sharing of royalties for content that's shared on digital platforms. There's nothing about things like Netflix and other digital platforms being treated on a level playing field with conventional providers. We get the feeling that the government is passing the buck to the CRTC, and the minister will surely explain that this is one way of making sure that, given that it's difficult to amend the legislation over the years to come, it'll be much easier for the CRTC to. Now, we know that's not necessarily true, but that will be their argument. There's no detail in this bill about the safeguards for the production of Canadian content. Once again, it's all being left up to the CRTC, and it'll be years before we get there, and the money's not being invested now. There are also no safeguards governing the percentage of French content, And a number of organizations have complained about that. And there's nothing about copyright either, or this will generate additional costs for the CRTC because there will have to be more paperwork for businesses, more work for the CRTC to do, more regulation. And the various reports also suggested that there should be more about the CBC's mandate, and there's nothing about that here in this bill.
This bill stems from a need to modernize an outdated law. There are new players, major players, Google, Netflix, Spotify, who are now on the market. These streaming services are not subject to the same rules as the traditional players in the industry. Will we include them all in our new modernized system? We systematically reiterate the need to modernize the Act in order to find a situation, a solution, which is fair for all producers. The costs are difficult to foresee at this point because we haven't received enough details. The CRTC does not have enough details, and so it cannot cost this. 71.9 million were costs for license rights. There will be new surveillance powers. The CRTC has not used them, but would be able to use them, and the CRTC would thus have to pay for this at the end of the day. The CRTC will also have the power to define what an online business is and what it means to produce and stream Canadian content. The percentage of Canadian content, based on the information we have, is usually between 25 and 40%. There will also be an obligation to contribute 5% to Canadian media to subsidize them for producing Canadian content. Media in 2019-2020 spent $193 million. And this does not fit with the numbers that the minister has given in recent press conferences. Streaming services wouldn't have to pay the 5% for Canadian content. Yet, the minister announced additional investments for streaming services, investments of $830 million up to $1 billion per year as of 2023. However, we didn't see the costing. We've asked how they arrived at this number, and our request was not answered. In the Heritage Committee, we were told that the minister would get back to us with those numbers, with the costing. We would have liked to receive those numbers and that analysis before this debate. It would have been really relevant. We're still waiting. Major players like Netflix are not sure whether they will be able to comply with the new regulations because they haven't received enough information. Traditional broadcasters can easily meet their content requirements because of, for example, sports content. However, bigger players like Netflix are telling us that they will have trouble complying with the new regulations because they produce, for instance, documentaries and TV shows, and they are in a different situation. There is nothing in the bill to deal with another issue. As of now, Netflix can't produce or fund Canadian content. Allow me to explain. Some content on Netflix, including Quebecois films called Jusqu'au déclin, they were filming in Sainte-Agathe-des-Monts. It was viewed 21 million times in its first few weeks online. It generated a huge windfall in Quebec. The film complied with 6 key creation and content requirements, but it wasn't certified or stamped as Canadian content because it was funded exclusively by Netflix. This is an important example. There were Canadian actors, Canadian technicians, Canadian cameramen. Netflix footed the whole bill, but it wasn't considered Canadian content with all of those Canadian contributions, and this type of situation would not be addressed by this bill. The Trudeau government would, in this bill, give so many powers to the CRTC. There would be no clear safeguards about contribution or mandatory minimum francophone content. The bill would also limit parliamentary committees' surveillance or supervision power. The CRTC would be able to appeal decisions. The Liberal government is giving us very little information and saying, just trust us and everything will work out. Well, we feel that that's unacceptable. We would have to wait several months for the CRTC to act, and the Parliament would be able to oversee the CRTC's work. Social media like Facebook, traditional media ask for fees urgently. In a minority situation, the government is a minority government. They should have presented a very clear bill with clear measures rather than telling us that they will eventually give us more details and give the CRTC more details. Now, I'd like to talk about French content in Quebec. There is only one thing in this bill to increase French content. It would be in Clause 3(1)K. Broadcasting services in English and French must be offered to all Canadians when possible with a progressive amount of English and French content which must be offered to all Canadians. Now, let's talk about French. I have posed questions to the ministers. My colleagues and I, we attended briefing meetings and we've asked questions about minimum content requirements, about quotas, about safeguards. We were told that we should just trust the CRTC. We were told that the quota was just fine. The quota was like a maximum. We need to give the CRTC the discretionary power to be able to make decisions rather than simply giving them a minimum and a maximum. I don't believe in that. The market can regulate itself. If necessary, people will go beyond minimum quotas. And we're told that this bill is historic, first of its kind. The minister has shared all of his accomplishments on social media. That said, the minister only shared the opinions of those who are satisfied with the bill. An example, the UPPCQ, Quebec's Producers Association, they demand that there be a minimum for French content on Netflix and other platforms. They are concerned about the protection and promotion of Quebec's culture, faced with what they call the anglicization of content on Netflix and Disney. French language rights are very topical, very important right now, and we see that in Quebec, they have their Bill 101. The Prime Minister doesn't support 101. The member for Saint Laurent, during COVID, organized an English language only event. That was problematic. The Minister for Official Languages has not clearly responded to a request from all opposition parties. We, with the NDP, we have insisted that Bill C1 be able to apply to federally regulated organizations. Quebecers are worried. We have our language and our culture. Canada is so blessed to have two official languages. Francophones, we travel around the world to share our culture, our language, our expertise. On this side of the house, we don't want to just trust the CRTC to protect the first language, the French language. So it's not just the opposition which is opposed. Web giants, a title says, are laughing wholeheartedly at this. A minister chose the U.S. election day to present this bill he's so proud of. If he were really proud of the bill, he would have chosen a day. a different day because timing is never random when we choose to present a bill. Friends of Broadcasting, a group, has said the Minister of Heritage's bill leaves Canadian broadcasters at the mercy of foreign competitors in competition. The bill should be much more specific, much more clear. This is what we're asking. There should be minimum local content quotas. Our cultural sovereignty is at risk. Journalists have also said that the CRTC will regulate and the web giants like Netflix can send lobbyists to Ottawa to negotiate with politicians and wield influence over them. These are quotes from important organizations who will be affected by C10. Broadcasting organizations have said that nowhere in this bill is there any modernization, substantial modernization of Radio-Canada CBC. This bill does not put an end to political nominations within the CBC committee. There are no requirements for non-commercial content on the CBC, and there are no requirements for local news media production either. I would like to now talk about the National Assembly of Quebec. The National Assembly asked that we get the Government of Canada to set fair minimum content requirements for French content and to have this enshrined in broadcasting legislation. We are not the only ones who are incredibly disappointed by this bill. We were looking for a hardier bill. We thought that we were all in agreement. We all wanted an act to modernize the Broadcasting Act to ensure that all players are on an even playing field. We all wanted to ensure a certain amount of Canadian content, French content, and we thought that all players would have equity and fairness in the system. That is not how the cookie has crumbled. The minister made a speech about hateful content online, hateful content that we needed to circumscribe online. We haven't heard anything about that since. We are waiting for details, especially our artists, authors, comedians. They were expecting a bill that would protect them. They have been offered crumbs. The minister appeared on the Québécois show Tout le monde en parle to talk about his bill. These aren't very serious political interviews, but it was an interview on TV with Guy Lepage. During this appearance on TV, the minister talked about hateful speech, hate speech online, and freedom of expression. One of the political analysts, he made an important point. He said that the minister's comments were a bit disturbing when it came to freedom of expression. He said freedom of expression ends when we start to hurt people's feelings. I mention this now because this should have been worked on. When it comes to web giants and social networks, we're told that we will have more information during the next step. La Petite Vie, it is a Radio-Canada show. It was taken off the air. Why? Well, because apparently there was a part of the show that might have hurt some people's feelings. Then there was some pressure. They decided to air the story after all. It was a very funny episode. The minister was talking about that, and it really begs the question, do we have freedom of expression? This bill is essential. The minister appeared on TV and he said that freedom of speech ends when we hurt people's feelings. So what? We hurt one Canadian's feelings and then we take content down. We don't allow producers to produce content because such and such would have hurt feelings. Well, I think that that is a dangerous path to go down. That would not be protecting the freedoms that we hold so dear in Canada, Madam Speaker. I see that my time is running out, so I'd like to begin to conclude. We have so many questions about the bill. The CRTC would have many powers that should rest with the legislator. We should ensure that there are requirements for Canadian content so that major players in streaming respect our content. We also want respect for French content. We hope that the minister will be listening attentively to all amendments we are suggesting. Questions and comments? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have so much to say. First, my colleague's party, they formed government for 10 years. They could have taken action. They did not. In fact, they even moved backwards in some ways. Some say that we are going too far. Others are saying we're not going far enough. And some say it will cost too much. I'm a bit confused. I've already answered questions about Facebook and Google. If you would allow me, I'd like to read an excerpt from a report. It says that the former opposition leader would... In fact, if you look at page 161 of the Yields report, it says in the recommendations, the CRTC must determine the true percentage that could apply, as well as afferent conditions for public hearings. This addresses the exact points that my colleague brought up. Our bill would not seek to make inequality continue to exist. In fact, it would bring about more equality. As for French, listen, in 2017, I won the Prix Impératif Prize. I am one of the few members of this House to have received this honor. This bill matters deeply to me. This bill would take the protection of French to the next level. We will ensure that the CRTC uphold even more requirements for French contents. Now, my colleague seems to feel that we haven't done enough for CBC Radio-Canada. Does this mean that the leader of the official opposition did not uphold his promise during the Conservative leadership race? He promised to end funding of CBC Radio-Canada, Madam Speaker. The Honourable Member for Richmond-Athabasca. I congratulate the Minister for receiving that prize. That's great. I really mean it, truly. I think that he should sit down with the member for Saint-Laurent to really understand how important French is. We could teach him a few things. It would be so great on this side of the House to sit down with someone who is really defending the French language. That's great. Now, I am not calling into question the minister's love of the French language and passion for defending it. And that's great that in this bill there would be protections for both English and French content. But these protections could be more substantial. There should be more details and more requirements. And these aren't just my words, the words of the member for Richmond-Athabasca, the words of my colleagues. No, I have quoted many organizations which will be directly impacted by this bill. I have named them. I have quoted them. I have not stood and given my personal opinions. I have spoken in the voice of those who will truly be impacted by this bill. I hope that the minister has truly heard the concerns of major players in the industry. I hope that the minister is listening to the amendments being proposed on this side of the House. I hope that we can thus have a stronger, better bill. We shouldn't just continue handing powers over the CRTC, especially when it's not relevant. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. Berthier-Masquinongé. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Now, I would like to take the minister at his word. I think he's acting in good faith. We're told that this is a first step. However, wouldn't a logical first step have been to insist on collecting taxes? We do it in Quebec. Why don't we do it in Ottawa? Is the government not once again handing responsibility over to someone else, in this case the CRC, handing decisions over to the CRTC? Then in a year or two down the line, when the industry is suffering, they'll be able to say, oh, it's the CRTC's fault. The Honourable Member for Athabasca. I thank my colleague for Berthier-Masquinanger, the member, for a beautiful writing, though I don't think it's quite as beautiful as my writing. The question posed is very relevant. I would like to refer to the interview, the minister's appearance on Tout le monde en parle. I knew that we'd be debating C10 today, and the minister's appearance on the show is very relevant. He made big speeches about freedom of expression, freedom of speech. He said he was working with other ministers. Then when it came to taxing web giants, all of a sudden the minister says, oh no, the Minister of Finance is responsible for taxing or not taxing web giants. So the minister is all for interministerial collaboration up to a certain point. Then when there's unfairness for taxing, well, we want everyone to pay equal taxes. Are we going to not tax all web giants? Whether we tax them all or don't tax them all, it has to be fair. It has to be the same approach for all. This matter is essential. We all agree on that much. The minister said that it would be included in a further or future budget. But there might be an election before that point, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont-Patrie. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. He addressed a number of interesting points. And just between him and me, I'm not convinced that what he said about Radio-Canada, CBC, I'm not sure about those, but I'd like to hear him on something that's very specific. That is, in the previous act, there was a certain proportion of Canadian content, and that ensured that we were able to optimize the talents and resources that we have here in Canada. And we also were able to optimize employment for Canadians, and that's disappeared under this bill. What does my honourable colleague think about that? The Honourable Member? Thank you for this very relevant question. Yes, and when we hear from the representatives of different organizations, and I was very surprised because I even I remember you nodding, Madam Speaker, when we talked about Netflix. You know, we wanted them to hire Quebecers and Canadians, but that is still not considered content. So they said, well, we want to go further, but is it in our interest to do so if we can't even have all those investments acknowledged? Because these players are ready to contribute, and they want to pay their fair share. But what they want in exchange is that this bill be fair too. It needs to be clear. It needs to be not random, and it needs, there are some people in this regulatory body, they're virtually inaccessible except for some lobbyists. So I think that, yes, it is troubling to see that section disappear from the bill, but that is part of our work as committee members to correct this through amendments, because this bill is not perfect, and I'd like to repeat here in this House, everyone agrees that this bill needed to be revamped. No one was against that. We're perhaps a bit disappointed with what came of it, but we're going to give the minister the chance to show his good faith and to make the amendments necessary to make this bill better. Thank you.
A question from the Honourable Member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for his speech. And my question is about the lack of regulation on the content that's going on to YouTube and Facebook. And we know that there's been a lot of misinformation that's been put onto these platforms. There's been racist content. There's been a lot of misogynist content. What would the honourable member like to see regulation on these platforms? They're not really platforms, they are publishers, and would he like to see them treated as publishers and the content that they publish come under this act?
The honourable member for Richmond North Athabasca.
But on le voit pas dans le...
But we don't see it in the bill. There's nothing in this bill that allows for the regulation of social media or platforms like YouTube. And it's clear, we would have liked to have seen this in the bill. The minister even says we have to find a way of preventing hate speech, conspiracy theories, and fake news that's shared. But right now in the bill, unfortunately, we won't even be able to amend it in that aspect, and because it's simply absent from the bill. The honourable member for Drummond. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, colleagues. And the crowd goes wild. I'm very pleased to speak to Bill C-10, and it's the first of the long-awaited bills from this Minister of the Heritage. The Liberal government's been working on this bill for 5 years. 5 years, 3 ministers, a media crisis, and a cultural industry in serious trouble. And in addition, a pandemic that has just dealt a death blow to many players in this cultural sector. When the Yale report came out, the minister said that he would not wait for a bill to regulate.